All right, so the title of this presentation is Objects and Memory, Looking at Martinican Colonial History and Identity through Jean-François Boclé's art. So I have always been mesmerized by what we call récup, that is the act of transforming discarded objects into works of art. So when I encountered Martinican artist Jean-François Boclé in Paris last June, I asked him how he went about choosing the objects that he used in his installations. In fact, chance encounters with the objects in any location would compel him to proceed with scientific caution to collect these objects, handle them with care and respect as he conceptualized and arranged their new histories. For an artist whose work is concerned with history and memory, discarded objects have the potency to tell multi-layered visual narratives and connect the past with the present. The history that Boclé performed through the use of these objects is the history of Martinique and, by extension, the history of the African diaspora, including the consumption of its bodies. The memory of enslavement, exploitation, and misrepresentations collide with the Republican ideals put forth by the metropole. Boclé's task is to unsilence this history by forcing the viewer to reflect on the tensions between the metropole and its colonies or overseas territories. In this presentation, I will mainly focus on 4 installations: Boat, The Tears of Banana Man, Tu me copieras, and Consommons racial. I will demonstrate how the performative use of collected objects creates a dialogical space where histories become visible. So Boat, an installation whose primary medium are used cardboard boxes, uses the ship as a metaphor with multiple ends that mirror the fate of its captives' fragmented selves. Here, the middle passage is vividly implied as a reference to multilateral journeys, not only to and from the old worlds, but also in between diasporic spaces, and also as a spiritual evocation of surviving rights and beliefs. The ship's potency as a marker of trauma, dislocation, and instability can also be read as a womb in which resistance is nurtured. The complex visualities of the boat motif that has been revisited multiple times in Black diaspora visual art speak to the ways in which the Atlantic journey is memorialized. For instance, in The Fragility of Smiles of Strangers Lost at Sea, African-American artist Betty Saar uses the map of a slave ship to produce a monochromatic blue text image composite that interrogates both the ship as a potential incubator for a group of strangers whose ties are grown within its confines, and the limits of abolitionism. Slave ships' plans were commonly found in abolitionist literature. Indeed, for slavery opponents such as Victor Schellcher, slavery was a social or moral question, not a national one, which meant that the problem of slavery lay not so much in the denial of freedom, but more in the alleged cruelty of the slave masters. In short, abolitionists favored an improvement of the system or amelioration rather than speedy abolition. Most importantly, as stated by art historian Carlos Celius, showing slavery in a museum space poses a number of challenges because the lack of objects reinforces the invisibility of the enslaved. Indeed, the majority of the objects are objects of servitude, objects of navigation, or those produced by the abolitionists. In short, the lack of balance between these objects and those that would represent the complex slave experience causes the enslaved body to disappear, overshadowed by the enslaver and the abolitionists. So reading Paul Gilroy's concept of the ship as a living, microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, or a vehicle of ideas and activists, against Edouard Glissant's right to opacity, or the right to subsist within an irreducible singularity, the right to nonconformity or to non-standardization, I would argue that the representations of the ship articulated by these visual artists escape transparency by claiming a right to diasporic memory and resistance. This is achieved not only via the ubiquitous ship motif, but also through the media chosen by Boclé. In Boat, the discarded cardboard folded boxes delineate a boat lit up by several light bulbs arranged along a straight line across the installation. The cardboard boxes are marked by various inscriptions such as up, down, handle with care, made in France, do not fold, and fragile. Those inscriptions can only be read and acknowledged from the outside, which creates a narrative whose meanings are manifold. If one reads the folded boxes as a metaphor for these transported Africans emptied of their essence by the Atlantic system, the printed text becomes the mark that was inscribed on the flesh of the captives along the African coast as an indication of the new cattle status. The outside is embodied by the captors, the traders, and the buyers. Slaves were made in France, in Bordeaux, Nantes, and in the colonies, but they were not handled with care. Nor were they considered fragile, as suggested by slave chief plants, logbooks, or enslaved narratives. Such representation of the Middle Passage brings the possibility to tell the untold by highlighting the tensions between new form and lost content, while speaking at the same time to the transformative experience of the Africans. Boclé's use of discarded objects echoes the creative process enslaved Africans underwent as they recreated a spiritual space in their new surroundings. As historian Stephanie Smallwood suggests, the Atlantic system forced the needs for Africans who had to make sense of their new environment and conditions, reaffirm some kind of much-needed relationship to ancestors, cope with death, build communities and relations of kinship, deal with the imbalance of power between blacks and whites, and reclaim their bodies to counter the plantation's economy claim to ownership. Transcending the violence of a colonial system that promoted acculturation, re-establishing spiritual roots and practices, and embracing new rooted selves is characteristic of Glissant's détour, as it produced metaphysical dissociation from the yoke of the colonial powers. Quilting traditions are illustrative of the détour. Indeed, some museums display surviving quilts made for slaves used with discarded cloth that demonstrates undeniable creative skills. The use of discarded objects is in and out of itself a powerful act of resistance against the Atlantic system. It is a refusal to let go of the past and the future. It is a refusal of the alienation of the present. That process of recreation and transformation from object to subject that gave some sort of agency to the enslaved is a powerful conceptualization of the African diaspora experience, for it emphasizes resistance. Furthermore, repurposing discarded objects empowered the artists by giving them the possibility not only to engender objects that were theirs, but also to leave a trace and build a legacy in spite of enslavement. On the other hand, the plight of the people of the sea is inscribed in a more contemporary context in which the economic destitution is played out. Boclé's cardboard boxes can be read as leftovers from the West, empty containers, and footprints of careless overconsumption illuminated by luridly arranged light bulbs. Both forces the viewer to rethink consumerism and to interrogate the presence and absence of the human factor both as consumer and commodity. The riches are not equally shared, which betrays the long legacy of the Atlantic system. In fact, the descendants of the street migrants can only stand on the outside, looking into a society to which they have contributed, but that has always marginalized them. Furthermore, both tell the ups and downs of post-colonial migrants, for instance, those who underwent the Birmingham experience and sailed to the metropole in search for better opportunities made in France. The Birmingham, or the Office of Migrations for Overseas Territories, were created in the early 60s to alleviate the island's overpopulation and to provide cheap labor for the metropole public sector. Marginalization, segregated housing, and a sense of loss characterized the Birmingham for many. This overlap between colonial and post-colonial realities is also tackled in Caribbean artist Terry Buddy's work, Blueprint, that revisits the Middle Passage by juxtaposing prints of slave ship plan with a bleak, condensed building that echoes the space to which immigrants are restricted. By juxtaposing these two visions, reinforced by the use of simplified lines and a monochromatic palette, Buddy draws a parallel between the forced naked migrants that were brought to the Caribbean and the fate of immigrants who are once again exploited in the receiving country, unable to find a working economic space for themselves. Moreover, this work highlights the significance of movement within the Black Atlantic and the subsequent ever-shifting identities that occur within that space, even though the power dynamics remain the same. However, the complexity of the Caribbean experience and its relationship to its own history and to the metropole cannot be readily understood, nor does it need to be. In Boclé's work, the essence of the boxes might remain unknown, undisclosed by the hyper-visible written text that tells us little about them and their relationship to their surroundings. Additionally, I would argue that the commonality and seemingly unidentifiable nature of the folded boxes does not translate into a universalizing experience engendered by globalization. Rather, they speak of the unifying diasporic experience in which the anonymous singularities of the strangers lost at sea, of those whose name don't matter to anyone but themselves, merge into what scholar Guillermina de Ferrari called an aleatory togetherness, a phrase that explores the idea of membership without consent. Both phrases express a condition fostered by the forced displacement in an enclosed vessel and a subsequent relocation within the boundaries of the plantation that enables resistance to thrive. Furthermore, art historian Edward Sullivan argues that images of travel and migration are common in modern contemporary Caribbean art to symbolize political and societal instability or tragic circumstances of the thousands who flee the island for both reason of economic privation and societal coercions. In that sense, the boat motif can indeed bear multiple layers of meaning, recalling the past and the present, as well as suffering, resistance, and shifting identities. So, what's in a banana? The tension between the past and the present, the metropole and the colony, the subject and the subject, and the consumption of the Caribbean body are also salient in the Tears of Banana Man, a piece made of 136 pounds of bananas that are lumped together in the shape of a life-size laying man. Avoir la banane, literally to have the banana, can be translated into smiling or being in a great mood. So why is Banana Man crying? A closer look at his edible banana body gives away the reason for his sadness. Again, in his effort to link body, memory, object, and text, Boclé has summed up the colonial history of Martinique, and by using English, Creole, and Spanish, the history of the Caribbean as a whole. The text, which Boclé refers to as clarification, read, Eat Your Liberty, Toxic Colony, Smile or Die, Garbage Tropics, Libertad o Bananas, Chlordécone mi amor. For over 20 years, a harmful pesticide called chlordécone was heavily used in the French West Indies to eradicate the banana weevil. The pesticide, known to cause endocrinal issues and increase the risk of prostate cancer, had been banned in the US as early as in 1976. In spite of studies showing its harmfulness, France continued to use it up until 1993, exposing a huge portion of the West Indian population and polluting the soil. According to Professor William Dabb, the head of the Science Committee for the Martinique and Guadeloupe Chlordécone Plan, Martinique and Guadeloupe must now cope with massive contamination of soil, river water, and sediments by a substance that remains toxic for centuries. About 80,000 people live in the areas where the soil is contaminated, and 13,000 absorb more chlordécone than their reference dose per day, simply by eating their own vegetables. First for sugar, now for its gold, the scarified body of Banana Man, the scarified body of the Martinican subject, has been eaten and discarded again. A couple of years earlier, in the Banana Project, Boclé denounced another infamous use of the West Indian gold. In this installation that features 25 pounds of bananas in the shape of a life-size man laying down, the text appears on 5 rectangular blackboards, which indicates its didactic purpose. At the top of each blackboard, the name of a prominent Afro-descendant soccer player is written in white chalk. A phone number is located on the platform on which the bananas are displayed. When calling the number, viewers are greeted by a message that says, "Yesterday, on the banks of the Mississippi River, strange fruits hanged from trees. Nowadays, in football stadiums, bananas and monkey noises are thrown at men." This piece was designed in response to a conversation that took place at an exhibition opening between Boclé and a proud descendant of enslavers who urged Boclé to forget about the past. So what's in a banana? In The Tears of Banana Man and the Banana Project, the banana itself demonstrates that, in spite of silences nurtured by the dominant French history narrative, past and present cannot be separated. The Banana Man might not be able to stand up from its platform to avenge the thousands of West Indians affected by the chloroquine or the soccer players' very public experience of blatant racism, but its very conceptualization, the everlasting symbol of the past consumed in the present, can start up a dialogue that might bring us to examine troubling historical continuities. The didactic approach and desire to unsilence colonial histories can be seen in Tu me copieras, or You will copy, or copieras. In this performance piece, the viewer is watching Boclé as he writes insistently on a blackboard. This scene that conjures up memories of childhood punishment when conjugating verbs of copying a sentence or a text on paper or on the blackboard for hours on end for the world to see also reminds us of what can be copied and what cannot, and which identities are muted according to the master. Indeed, the text that Boclé is writing in white chalk and that the viewer is simultaneously listening to with headphones are the 60 articles of the infamous 1685 Code Noir, or Black Code, used to police social relations between slaves and masters on the French islands until the abolition of slavery in 1848. In describing his powerful piece, Boclé reflects on the status of the enslaved as objects, goods, movable assets. He writes that history has been erased from the textbooks of my childhood so that this major part of the European, African, and American memories could sink into oblivion. Because it clashes with the other memory, the collective one, the memory that is taught and passed on, the great deeds of the Sun King and the Enlightenment. The writings are superimposed and gradually saturate the blackboard with chalk. The blackboard becomes a white monochrome. I do not use the eraser. As I write, I go blind. What other look than that of blindness can support that excess? The last piece that this paper will examine is Consommons racial, or Let's Consume Racial, presented at the 31st Bienal de Pontevedra in Spain. This particular piece is made of objects collected during Boclé's travels to France, Belgium, Lebanon, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Spain, and Sweden. These objects range from pancake boxes, rum, chocolate powder, metallic cleaning sponges, garbage bags, spicy salsa. By seeing all these objects put together on one single shelf, Boclé wants the viewer to interrogate not only the black body, not only how the black body is consumed, but also how it is perceived, as objects showcasing white bodies are also displayed. The positioning of the black body as subservient or over-sexualized, smiling their way from the kitchen to the bedroom, is seen in contrast with that of a sturdy white baby in suit dressed for a pure, right, successful future. As a French viewer, the sight of the banana chocolate powder conjures up memories of childhood as the smiling, illiterate black character stood on a breakfast table every morning. The same black character evoked by Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask as the embodiment of blackness. And I quote, the white man had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories. I was responsible at the same time for my body, my face, for my ancestors. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics, and I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, Jean-François Boclé's art. So I have always been mesmerized by what we call récup, that is the act of transforming discarded objects into works of art. So when I encountered Martinican artist Jean-François Boclé in Paris last June, I asked him how he went about choosing the objects that he used in his installations. In fact, chance encounters with the objects in any location would compel him to proceed with scientific caution to collect these objects, handle them with care and respect, as he conceptualized and arranged their new histories. For an artist whose work is concerned with history and memory, Right, so the title of this presentation is Objects and Memory, looking at Martinican colonial history and identity through words, but also in between diasporic spaces, and also as a spiritual evocation of surviving rights and beliefs that ship's potency as a marker of trauma, dislocation, and instability can also be read as a womb in which resistance is nurtured. The complex visualities of the boat motif that has been revisited multiple times in Black diaspora visual art speak to the ways in which the Atlantic journey is memorialized. For instance, in The Fragility of Smiles of Strangers Lost at Sea, African-American artist Betty Saar usually focused on 4 installations: Boat, The Tears of Banana Man, Tu me copieras, and Consommons racial. I will demonstrate how the performative use of collected objects creates a dialogical space where histories become visible. So Boat, an installation whose primary medium are used cardboard boxes, uses the ship as a metaphor with multiple ends that mirror the fate of its captives' fragmented selves. Here, the middle passage is vividly implied as a reference to multilateral journeys, not only to and from the old world. Discarded objects have the potency to tell multi-layered visual narratives and connect the past with the present. The history that Boclé performs through the use of these objects is the history of Martinique and, by extension, the history of the African diaspora, including the consumption of its bodies. The memory of enslavement, exploitation, and misrepresentations collide with the Republican ideals put forth by the metropole. Boclé's task is to unsilence this history by forcing the viewer to reflect on the tensions between the metropole and its colonies or overseas territories. In this presentation, I will mainly